المبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. Alhamdulillah, in part 2 of lesson 10, where we began by looking at the obligatory prayer times. And we emphasized looking at some of the principles related to the prayer times. Particularly, what is the key principle according to Imam Abu Hanifa about the prayer times? Yeah, the prayer time does not enter except with certitude and does not exit except with certitude. So we went through the obligatory prayer times on the basis of that. Now, next we're going to be looking at the recommended prayer times. فقال الإمام حافظ الدين والملة النسفي رحمه الله تعالى في كنز الدقائق ونفعنا به وبكم وندب تأخير الفجر. It is recommended to delay Fajr. وظهر الصيف, and ظهر in the summer. والعصر ما لم تتغير الشمس. والعشاء إلى الثلث. So Asr until the sun hasn't changed. We'll see what that means. And Isha until 1/3. Until 1/3. 1/3 of the night. والوتر إلى آخر الليل, and it's recommended to delay witr until the end of the night. لمن يثق بالانتباه. So anyone who is sure of waking up. Right? وتعجيل ظهر الشتاء, and it is أي وندب تعجيل ظهر الشتاء, and it's recommended to hasten ظهر in winter months. والمغرب, right? And it's recommended to hasten maghrib, hasten beginning maghrib, and this is mentioned unconditionally. وما فيها عين يوم غين, and any prayer, any fard prayer that has the letter ayn on a day where the sky is occluded, غين, where it's occluded. Okay, so a few things here. When it comes to the recommended, the recommendation broadly has two bases. What are they? One is what is established by specific text, and number two, what is established by fulfilling the meanings related to prayer or congregational prayer, right? In general. Now, those are two guiding principles. When it comes to prayer, it has come from our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he said that, and it's multiple hadiths, amongst them the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud when he asked, what is the best of actions? Ayyul amali afdal? The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-imanu billah. Thumma ay, then what? The Prophet ﷺ said, As-salatu ala waqtiha. Prayer at its time. And there's a few different narrations of this. So, if we step back, Imam al-Shafi'i radiallahu ta'ala anhu took from the specific encouragement to pray, what he understood to be the specific encouragement to pray at the beginning of the time, and from the specific basis that any good deed, it is recommended to hasten it. So therefore the default in the Shafi'i school is, unless there's a clear reason, preference is given to praying early. Right? And if you travel with God-fearing Shafi'is, it can be tough as a Hanafi. Right? I've been up with Shaykh Yahya, and 15 minutes into Sayyidi, we're going to lose the waqt al-fadila. said, see, I could go to sleep and have lucid dreams and wake up and the waqt al-fadila is barely entering, right? Because Fajr time is so long and it's not recommended. He said, you're relaxed. I said, no, see, we're both like, reading dhikr or whatever. He's making dhikr, I'm reading fiqh or whatever, but he's getting really tense. I said, we're going to lose the waqt al-fadila. We're both up, let's pray. And that's good. That's good. And I'd usually just concede to him. But Allahumma salli ala sayyidina. So that's the governing consideration according to Sayyid al-Shafi'iyya. And that's muhtamal al-nusus. In the Hanafi school, it's not that way. Why? Because if we look at it textually, then yes, we would agree that generally it's better to hasten the good. We agree that's very broadly, generally true. We don't dispute that. Right? So if you have a khatir al-khair, what should you do? Let's say you're sitting on $5,000 and suddenly you realize that there's somebody who's trying to provide medical treatment for their cat. Now you're not going to give a lot of money for that. Maybe a $5 donation. You get that thought? What should you do? Do it right away. But when it comes to prayer, let's begin textually. There's 5 daily prayers. Fajr, right? And then we'll go into the fiqh of it, but just to understand the basis. Fajr, it is related from our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he prayed at the beginning of the time and late. Right? Beginning of the early Fajr time is called al-ghalas. Ghalas. This is when it's still dark. There's a number of hadiths about praying Fajr when it's still dark. And other hadiths of them praying when it was bright. Right? Which is called waqtul isfar. Right? Isfar, when it is bright. Right? Right? But the Hanafis would argue, now how do you join between the 2 hadiths? Both are established, and we're not talking about permissibility, but which is superior? In usul terms, what is given precedence? Actions or words in establishing a ruling? Words. So both are established from the actions. Actions have all kinds of possibilities. Right? But the specific virtue of praying Fajr textually is established. The hadith in the Sunan, amongst them Tirmidhi and others, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Asfiru bil Fajr, فَإِنَّهُ أَعْظَمُ لِلْأَجْرِ." Pray Fajr when it's bright, for it is greater in reward. Greater than what in reward? Than not praying it? No, greater in reward than praying it early. So therefore, what would be recommended? The isfar. The isfar. Imam al-Tahawi explains that both are allowed. That's not a question at all. But one of the ways of understanding the ghalas is that early on, the Prophet ﷺ used to pray much longer. When there's still the sabiqun al-awwalun, the earlier, muhajirin and the ansar, their numbers were quite small. They had a higher level of faith and practice. But then when people started entering, that's why the Hanafis understand it's a lengthy discussion of preference. You can stay out of the whole thing. Say, look, the Prophet ﷺ is a'zam lil ajr. Then get out of the whole thing. Okay, no need to get into it. Say, we just affirm both. But that the Prophet ﷺ used to start the prayer fi waqti ghalas, at the time when it was dark, and complete it fi waqti al-isfar. And this is discussed by Tahawi and others. But the mu'tamad of the Hanafi school is that one begins it in ghalas, in isfar, when it's bright, and ends it in time of isfar, when it's bright. Why? Because of the sunnah extent of recitation, right? Which will come up when we look at, and you can see it in fully articulated in Nur al-Idah, sunnah recitation. So that's textually. The other basis is that congregational prayer is based on ijtima', salatul jama'ah, and the asl of prayer for men is congregation. So all that facilitates the congregation is praiseworthy. All that facilitates the congregation is praiseworthy, without it resulting in any disliked meanings. Right? أن يدخل الشك أو الكراهة. Right? Unless you enter into a doubtful time, that you prayed so late in Fajr, now it's doubtful, did you pray within the time or not? Or unless you enter into a textually established disliked time. So these are governing criteria. So the Hanafis did not accept that the basis of all prayers to pray at the beginning of the time. Fajr is textually established to delay. Dhuhr in summer months because it's hot. The Prophet ﷺ said, أبردوا بالظهر. Pray dhuhr when it cools. فإن شدة الحر من فيح جهنم. Because intense heat is from the breaths of hell. And the ulama had a field day with that, because what's the asl in speech? Literal or metaphorical? Literal. But now sometimes when the ulama discuss certain things, the ulama think rigorously. And people misunderstand it sometimes, right? So I think through the whole possibilities. How do you think about this scholastically? It is from the breaths of paradise. This could be literal or figurative. If literal, then these are the possibilities. That could be said min fayhijan, from that it comes to us from Jahannam to earth. But then how does it not burn things? Rahmah of Allah, right? You assume rahmah about anything, right? So they think too, said no, probably not. Then they consider other possibilities of it being literal. Then they go to the majaz, which is the discomfort, right? So why are they thinking like this? Because frequently errors in understanding are made when you jump to a seemingly obvious conclusion without thinking through the possibilities. Even if you have to train your mind to think through the possibilities. Okay, so dhuhr, summer months, and by summer they mean when it's hot. When it's hot. It doesn't have to be summer per se, because many places it's hot 7, 8, 9 months of the year. So when it's hot, it's recommended to delay dhuhr. How? Such that it would be comfortable to walk in the, so that there are shadows in which you can walk comfortably, and such that people would not reasonably hold back from attending the congregation. Asr is recommended to delay in the Hanafi school. Why? We won't go into the legal discussion on that, but a number of hadiths affirm that. One of them goes back to appreciation of language. Right? Later in your studies, you look at the textual evidence in more detail, but the same hadith, وَصَلِّ الْعَصْرِ وَالشَّمْسُ بَيْضَاءُ نَقِيَّةٌ. Pray Asr, وَالشَّمْسِ, when the sun is بَيْضَاء نَقِيَّةٌ. This waw, is this lil-hal, while the sun is clear, right? Meaning it's not begun to yellow, the rays of it, so it's not the end of the late in the time, or this waw is understood lexically to have the meaning of ghaya, meaning while the sun is still bayda'u naqiyya. And from the context and the usage of the Arabs, and in light of the other texts, Imam Abu Hanifa understood that pray Asr وَالشَّمْسِ, while the sun is still clear, meaning while the sun is still clear. Because Asr has the idea of that which is squeezed out. Asr refers to the late, to what we can call, to steal a literary title, the remains of the day. Ever read Remains of the Day? You did? Okay, very sad. The remains of the day, right? That's why al-Asr is by the passing of time, right? That's it. Anyways, and then there's specific hadiths of, to pray by the time a rider would reach such and such people. And that takes considerable amount of time to get there. So it'd be, so we don't want to get, so the Hanafis did not accept this general principle. The Isha to a third of the night. And then we'll see there's ikhtilaf about that. Is that all year, or is this in winter months? Delaying Isha, because let's say in winter months, how early does Isha get in Toronto? In December, let's say. Much early. Especially, keep in mind the time change too. Yeah, it reaches before 6 p.m. But let's say 6 p.m. Now, in the days when people still went to work, could people comfortably attend Isha if it's at 6 p.m.? No. So by the time they get home from the commute, normally people don't want to, they won't be able to make it. It'll be difficult. Or be on the way home, then you get in trouble with the spouse, etc. So, delaying Isha, and there's hadiths about that, right? There's also hadiths about praying right in the beginning. That's يختلف باختلاف الأحوال. And witr at the end of the night, if short, because of the hadiths about that as well. But this is لمن يثق بالانتباه. And يثق, what does the فعل مضارع indicate? What does the fi'l mudari' indicate? Continuity. Right? That someone who actively, now some other mutun put it as liman wathiqa bil intibah, right? That they're sure, right? But yathiq, that but the indication here is on an ongoing basis, they're sure that they'll wake up. Why? Because the ruling of witr is that it is wajib and it's a fard amali. Therefore, to do something that would cause you to have a reasonable possibility of missing a duty would be sinful. Right? So what's the ruling of delaying witr till the end of the time? Till the end of the night? What is it? Mustahab. It's recommended. What's the ruling of making sure you pray witr on time? It's wajib. That's fard amali. It's close to being fard. It's operationally like a fard. So, if you're not sure that you'll be able to in fact pray it within the time, without reasonable possibility of failure to do so, then avoiding failing a duty is more important than attaining a recommended benefit. So if you're like, okay, I need to leave right now, otherwise I might not make it to the beginning of the khutbah. So, but I didn't use itr. One of the sunnahs. There are many sunnahs for Jumu'ah. And if this caused you to fall into shak, reasonable doubt that by the time I find it, I may end up getting late to the khutbah, the act of doing the recommended act there would be sinful. Even if you caught it. Because that taqseer is you're held accountable for it as well. Because لِلْوَسَائِلْ حُكْمُ الْغَايَات means take the rulings of ends. And people are negligent about this. Oh, alhamdulillah, made it on time. What were you doing? So, oh, I got busy looking for my topi and my miswak and my this. I was worried I wouldn't get on time. Finding your topi, miswak, siwak, and all these things, it's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's legally sinful. If it put you in real danger of being late. And in winter, it's one, hastens dhuhr. So that because the time is brief. Okay? The time is brief. And we'll see, and maghrib unconditionally. Why? Because of the commands that came to pray maghrib without delay. So let's look at these. It's recommended to delay Fajr, right? And now let's look at it from the legal perspective. It is recommended, right? These apply to the congregational prayer for men, right? And for women, there's two opinions with them. One is that generally they pray right at the beginning, because they don't have to wait for congregation. That is generally best to pray at the beginning of the time, unconditionally. In Muslim countries, frequently they say the fatwa should be follow the adhan of the masjid. Follow the adhan of the masjid. Because the adhan typically follows the prayer, not the beginning of the time. Right? So follow the adhan of the masjid. There's a theoretical relied upon position, but practically the ulama say, because otherwise, what's the point of the adhan? Especially في حق عامة الناس. Follow the adhan. Right? And the delay of dhuhr, to delay fajr, meaning towards the latter part of the time, such that were it to become manifest that their fajr was not valid, they would have enough time to make tahara and to pray again the sunnah fajr length with the sunnah recitation well before the end of the time. It could be in the last half hour, let's say, of fajr time, plus or minus. Right? Dhuhr in the summer, such that people could comfortably attend the congregation of those who would normally attend. Asr, such that you would comfortably finish it before the waqt al-karaha. And we'll look at what the disliked times are. And of the many benefits of it is takthiran lin-nawafil, to be able to pray more nafil prayer as well. Right? Nafil didn't go out. There's no naskh on the recommendation of nafil. Right? And Isha to a third of the night. Particularly in winter months. Right? When, and generally this is such that it facilitates the congregation. If facilitating the congregation would require more than this, then we'll do more than this. If delaying it to 1/3 of the night would result in taqleel al-jama'ah, in reducing the congregation, then delaying it to 1/3 of the night would be makruh. This is why they say in summer months, this would be makruh to do in those places where Isha is already late. Because the supposition of this is, so the Isha, particularly in winter, where it would be difficult for people to attend. Ma'mura, and witr to the end of the night, we mentioned. But if one's not sure of waking, Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu relates, the awsani khalili bi thalath. My dearly beloved one, meaning the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, advised me with 3 matters. The third one of which was وَأَنْ أُوتِرَ قَبْلَ النَّوْمِ, that I perform witr before I go to sleep. And the reason behind that with Sayyidina Abu Hurairah was that because of how much he dedicated himself to seeking knowledge, he became exceedingly poor and exceedingly weak. That's how the hadith came to us, through sacrifice, right? Not through chilling out. Sometimes he'd have spasms after dhuhr. People think that he's having like a fit. But it wasn't a fit, it was the intensity of hunger causing him to collapse. Now that's not recommended, it's actually disliked, because if you can't handle things like that, don't do it, right? That's why when some of the young tabi'een went to visit one of the Sahaba, they're looking at him enviously, and we wish he was there. He got very upset with them. He said, what is wrong with some people that they say, if only we had been in such and such time and in such and such place? What do these people know how they would have acted had they been there? How would they have acted and how have they responded? Right? That's why the Prophet ﷺ, لَا تَتَمَنَّوْا لِقَاءَ الْأَعْدَاءِ, do not hope for the meeting of the enemy. وَلَكِنْ سَلُوا اللَّهَ الْعَافِيَةِ, but rather ask Allah for wellness. If there's enough to do what you can with what you have, and that's part of gratitude. If Allah's facilitated food for you, so I'm going to do without it to study? No. The alam al-asbab entails eat what you need and do what you must do. Right? If you create enough momentum in your studies or in whatever, then those circumstances may arise, and then you see how you handle them when they arise. But you don't choose things like that for yourself, right? Ibn Ata'illah describes that kind of conduct as min ash-shahwati al-khafiyya, from hidden lust. From hidden lust. Right? Why? Because it's driven by your desires and whims. It's not driven by reason, nor the good pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yuridu Allahu bikum al-yusr. Allah says He wants ease for you. And you want to make things difficult. Yassiru wa la tu'assiru. Right? So that's why shahwa khafiyya is following your desires and whims and not Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. So these are the recommended times. It's recommended to hasten dhuhr in winter and maghrib unconditionally. And there's something to be careful about. Maghrib, even slight delay in maghrib is somewhat disliked, beyond the reasonable. The optimal way of praying maghrib is when the time comes in, adhan is given, and there's only a brief pause, we'll see it in the adhan, after which one prays. So between adhan and iqama, they say, and of course this is للمبالغة, قدر ثلاث تسبيحات, 3 tasbihs. It's not literally 3 tasbihs, because the muezzin might be on the minaret. Is the muezzin supposed to miss the prayer? No. Right? Give the adhan, come down, and without delay, like meaning the slightest delay. So and we'll see the makruhat of maghrib, right? Which is why the basis in our madhab is that the praying nafil after maghrib time enters, basis is that it's not legislated. It's khilaf al-mashru'. And then we'll get to that. I might be in subtle reconsideration of my position, but the asl of the madhab is that there is no specifically recommended sunnah before maghrib. So the asl of the madhab is, even if they give time, there's no prayer to do, because the imam's delaying. So their sitting is ibadah. One of my mentors, who would always pray 2 rak'ahs, I asked him, why does he do it? He said, because there's time, and it's ibadah. He said, but it's not mashru'. He said, there's khilaf. I said, I'm not here to argue that, I want to understand. He said, you think it's better for you to sit down than for me to be praying two rak'ahs during that time? I said, yes. So he took my head and kissed me on the forehead. He said, you're a Hanafi. I said, so are you, Sidi. But Allahu A'lam. And all prayers with ayn on cloudy days. What are the prayers with ayn? Asr and Isha. What? So why, like, ما فيه عين, couldn't you just put والعصر والمغرب? No, it's Asr, Maghrib and Isha. On cloudy days. Right? Then this is if you fear falling into the makruh time. Right? This is conditional. Now if you're following reliable, time calculations, then it's cloudy, there's a storm, whatever. If there's no fear, this is out of fear of falling into makruh time. Asr, Maghrib, Isha. Are hastened. Asr, because it's got a makruh tahriman time. Maghrib, because any delay is makruh in it. And Isha, because if it's cloudy or dark, then people won't come to the congregation if you delay it. Other prayers are delayed in it to be sure that the time is in, Fajr and Dhuhr. So these are the recommended. Then next we look at the prohibited times of prayer. So he says, and this is something that we should diagram from the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya, and inshallah, did we request that already? The disliked times? Did we share it? Okay, so we'll be sharing this week inshallah. The disliked times from the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya, you can also see them in considerable detail in Nur al-Idah. Right? And the base of the prohibited times is the prohibition of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? The prohibition of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, number one. Number two, because worship, what's the basis of worship? Right? Worship expresses التذلل, humbling oneself before one's creator. Right? But how does one humble oneself? As he has commanded, on his terms. So there's a wisdom that while prayer is the best of matters, we, in humbling ourselves as he has commanded, that part of it being an expression of slavehood and not personal desire, that it's not just based on on acting, but also on desisting. That I pray because I've been commanded to pray and I've been encouraged to pray, but I also desist from prayer because I've been commanded to desist from prayer. Okay. Sometimes we've been commanded not to pray. Others we've been discouraged from praying. Right? So there's levels of prohibition in there. And the Prophet ﷺ also connected this to realities of the unseen. To realities of the unseen. Right? That with the passing of as time passes, there are spiritual realities from the unseen of both light and dark taking place around us. In one of the hadiths, that's a nahu hadith. What's a hadith of the Prophet that has nahu in place? يَتَعَاقَبُونَ فِيكُمْ مَلَائِكَةٌ بِاللَّيْلِ وَمَلَائِكَةٌ بِالنَّهَارِ. What is the issue?
There's a wow.
Yeah. يَتَعَاقَبُونَ فِيكُمْ مَلَائِكَةٌ. The fa'il is already there. So why is it that way? You can figure that out grammatically. We don't need to. You know why it's that way? Okay. I'm pretty sure it comes up in Sharh al-Qadr and elsewhere. Anyways, that the night, the angels of night and day alternate, right? At Fajr and Isha time, right? There are our actions being raised as well. But just as the angels have their shifts at Fajr time, at Maghrib time, at Isha time, right? But there's also other phenomenon of the unseen. And the Prophet ﷺ warned us. Because just as, are you morally responsible for pollution that you haven't done? So if you were to go to Lahore during the burning the crop season, are you culpable for there being pollution in Lahore? Inshallah, you didn't do it. But if you breathe that in, will it hurt you? Yes. Similarly, there are things around us spiritually that we need to be aware of. You didn't do it, but you could get affected by it. Right? You get affected by it. From that is that time of sunrise. That time of sunrise, it's a very blessed time, but it is also a time not to be praying in. The Prophet ﷺ explained. Yeah. Similarly, the end of Asr time. It's a time not to be praying, and these two times have been connected. That in the realm of the unseen, this is a time that shaitan has a hadh regarding. Part of the test of how creation is between veils of light and darkness, but it's there. And the Prophet ﷺ has told us about these. We read about the times of prayer, you can see the hadiths. And these are also realities, because we don't live in a material world. Right? And from the Quran and the Sunnah, it's very clear that there are three levels, there are three worlds, and they're all there, it's just which one you're present with. Al-mulk wal-malakut wa kadhaka al-jabarut. Right? The mulk, the material world, and the malakut, and the angelic world, or the world of the unseen. كذلك الجبروت, and likewise, the world of the divine presence, which is, and they're not three different worlds. That one's over there, that one's over there. It's all here. Right? And these are realities. And the Prophet ﷺ has told us. And by adherence to what he says, we navigate that, even if we're not aware of it. Likewise, for example, one of the neglected sunnahs, just yesterday someone was talking to me about something, I was a bit disturbed that they were not taking that into account, that everybody, it is makruh, without reason, to be out during the time of sunset. It's not good to even keep one's animals roaming outside at that time, until the sun has clearly set. Right? Unless one goes out for a hajjah, because then one is protected. Right? And the hadith would affirm that, and the commentators on the hadith have talked about that. Okay? But if you just you want to take a stroll and just like that during just the sunset time, don't do it. Like when the sun has set. Well, one is because you're supposed to be praying Maghrib without delay, but just wait a little bit, and they differed how long. So he says, وَمُنِعَ عَنِ الصَّلَاةِ وَسَجْدَةِ التِّلَاوَةِ وَصَلَاةِ الْجَنَازَةِ عِنْدَ الطُّلُوعِ. It is interdicted to pray and to perform the prostration of recital and funeral prayer during sunrise. And this is, what is during sunrise? It's once Fajr time has exited till the sun has clearly risen. قَدْرَ رُمْحٍ أَوْ رُمْحَيْنِ. Again, they differ on exactly specifying 15, 20 minutes. Some say less, some say even down to 12 minutes. But there's leeway. Because they mention قَدْرَ رُمْحٍ أَوْ رُمْحَيْنِ. And when the sun is rising until it's clearly risen. So if someone missed Fajr and they wake up during sunrise time, what do? They should not perform it during that time. Right? Or they cannot perform it during that time, because if you pray Fajr during sunrise time, what's the ruling? It is? The fard is not valid. It's not valid. And it's sinful. It's obligatory to break. Right? But they say, لكن لا ينهى عنها العوام. But the uneducated are not told not to do it. لأن الصلاة الصحيحة ولو بالكراهة على مذهب من مذاهب الأئمة أولى من تركها. Right? Because that's the mansus in the madhab. That, however, the uneducated are not told not to do it. Why? Because a prayer that is valid on any one school, in the Shafi'i school and some others, praying that prayer is that fard is valid, but there's dislikedness in it. But there's dislikedness. Is it less bad for them to pray something that is disliked, or for them not to be doing it, full stop? Doesn't mean they say, yeah, fine, just go ahead, do it. Means just don't correct them. Okay. And if they knew, would they be doing it? No. If someone knew that it's makruh to pray at this time, they wouldn't do it. But then the problem isn't that they're doing it. The fact that they're praying is good. The problem is a lack of knowledge. And there's an obvious lack of quwwat al-iman, that they're praying outside. Like they delayed Fajr that much that it went outside. So lack of knowledge and lack of iman. So deal with the symptom, not the cause. Sajdat al-tilawa. And there's some tafsir about sajdat al-tilawa. You'll see it from the diagram. Because if the sajdat al-tilawa was recited before the time, then performing it during that would not even be valid. Why? Because it was due, complete. So it's not fulfilled by performing it during a deficient time. And Salat al-Janaza. Again, wait till sunrise. Likewise, the istiwa, which is waqt al-zawal. Right? Now sometimes, waqt al-zawal, now literally zawal is when the sun now goes past its zenith. The istiwa is the moment the sun is at its zenith, which literally is a moment. But out of caution, a few minutes before Dhuhr time. And there are some apps actually that try to calculate these various phenomena. Wal ghurub, and when the sun is setting. Conceptually, sunrise and sunset are exact opposites. Because the sun does not hop, skip and jump. Right? Really? It goes. So, sunrise, again, the sunset time, to be careful, they would say, about 20 to 30 minutes, maybe 20 minutes in winter, 30 minutes in the summer, roughly. Right? And the ghurub here is when the sun is setting. Right? When the sun is setting. Right? And the sign of its setting is, they describe it descriptively. Right? Which is why just giving a time is different. Which is that were you to look at the sun, you wouldn't be dazzled by its rays. Or the isfirar, the rays of the sun become clearly yellow. They mention different things. The relied upon definition is that were you to بأن لا تحار العين عند النظر إلى الشمس. The eye is not dazzled when you look at the sun, because now it's closer to setting. Because when the sun's high, its rays are clear, they're dazzling. Right? And people have experience with this. Don't just try to figure it out yourself. There's people who've prayed before. There's people who know this phenomenon, so they explain it. Right? And maybe because I just have bad eyesight. When I was young, I tried to look towards the sun. I knew you shouldn't stare at it, but my eyes never felt dazzled by it. Maybe just because of my glasses. So I had to ask around. Right? Okay. So these are the except that day is Asr. So the delay is prohibitively disliked. The delay is prohibitively disliked. That delay affects the performance of the Asr prayer itself. So the Asr prayer is obligatory to perform. The act of delaying was prohibitively disliked. But that prohibitive dislikedness does affect the prayer itself. So pay attention to this, because some of the ulama said that the karaha is in the delay. What does that mean? That the prayer itself is not affected by that karaha. The relied upon position is no. The ada itself is disliked, meaning the act of delaying was sinful, was prohibitively disliked, makruh tahriman, so it was sinful. But that delay affects, bequeaths a dislikedness to the prayer itself. So let's say we have a brother named Sidi Yaqub. He's getting married. So he had a simple marriage. All that he wanted was a well-made Black Forest cake. But it had to come at 10:30 p.m. because beyond that, his close friends would be leaving. Right? So that was a condition. So now, when the Black Forest cake was delayed beyond the latest time, no later than 10:45, was the delay breach of agreement? Yes. They delayed it till 11:30. Was the delay sinful? Yes. But does that affect the actual eating of the cake? Yeah. Because it wasn't done in its right time, in the right context, etc. So does that dislikedness of the delay not affect the act itself? Yeah. So anyways, that's just litamthil. So it's not either the act of delaying is disliked and that dislikedness enters into the prayer itself. Do not delay Asr even when you're traveling. Even if you're in a meeting, etc. I mean, someone who's, even if sick, if it's within your control to do it early, like don't say, okay, I'll perform wudu, pray Asr, and then wait a little bit, pray Maghrib. You can't do that. Sinful. Right? Because there's firm karaha of that delay. Then he says, recommended prayers are not allowed after Fajr and Asr prayers. Right? So he tells us that وعن التنفل بعد الفجر والعصر. Right? Nafil prayers are not allowed after Fajr. After the Fajr prayer. So once you prayed Fajr, no Nafil, including the Sunnah of Fajr, is permitted. So someone got to the masjid, they hadn't done the Sunnah of Fajr, they can pray the Sunnah of Fajr due to its great emphasis. And we'll be looking at this Sunnah prayers. You can pray it before joining the congregation, away from the congregation, but if you weren't able to do the Sunnah of Fajr before the Fajr prayer, it's makruh tahriman to pray it after this Fajr prayer. If you walked out from one masjid, walked to another masjid, entered during Fajr time, It'd be makruh tahriman to do tahiyyat al-masjid. You got a work offer at Fajr time, after Salat al-Fajr, it'd be makruh tahriman to do Salat al-Istikhara. Any nafil after Salat al-Fajr is not permitted. Qada is permitted, as we'll see. And likewise the Asr prayer. Once you've done the Fard of Asr, no specific nor general nafil is allowed. But he tells us that making up missed prayers, because these are incumbent on you, are permitted in that time. Prostrations of recital are valid. A funeral prayer is permitted at that time. They did Fajr and then a funeral came, it'd be valid to pray it. Be valid to pray it. Right? There's other contingent makruhat. So he tells us that وَبَعْدَ طُلُوعِ الْفَجْرِ بِأَكْثَرَ مِنْ سُنَّةِ الْفَجْرِ. It's disliked to pray after Fajr time enters more than the 2 rak'ahs of the sunnah of Fajr. And the basis of this is that our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us prayer is the best of matters. And Fajr is one of the times of devotion. But Sayyidah Aisha tells us that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not do after Fajr time entered more than the 2 rak'ahs of sunnah. Right? So now, this is a description of his words, but there's an indication of dislikedness in them, given all the factors that would entail that were there any merit to pray at that time, he would have, even if it were to show permissibility. So in our madhab it's taken, there's other nusus about it. It's also makruh to pray before Maghrib, because it entails the delay of Maghrib, right? So what's for sure agreed upon in the madhab is that it is not good to leave a gap between the adhan and iqamah, right, in itself. But if it's done, like they leave a gap between adhan and the iqamah, there's enough time to pray 2 rak'ahs, then there are some of the ulama who said, amongst them Ibn al-Humam and others, rahimahumullah ta'ala, then if they're leaving the gap already, it's fine to pray in it. There's no sunnah there, as not from the practice of the Khulafa al-Rashideen or the 10 promised paradise, etc. Ibn Abbas knows. That's why I realized it was a sunnah that was and ceased to be. I'm much more willing to concede, to acknowledge that if there's already a gap being left between the adhan and the iqamah, can one pray nafil? I'm not willing to concede that it is recommended. We say it's not makruh in that sense, okay. But is it recommended? The asl in the madhab is no. And there's difference of opinion about it. And if they do it, you don't, because in the Shafi'i school it's recommended to pray 2 rak'ahs there. There's some ikhtilaf within the Hanafi madhab as well. So you can be soft-headed about it. You don't have to correct people, even if Hanafis. Anyone can ask. There used to be a time, it used to be pretty, like I'd go up to my teacher, very lovingly, politely, privately, ask Maulana. So anyways, and at the time of the khutbah, it's makruh tahriman, it is sinful to pray during the time of the khutbah. Once the khatib, now strictly it's not from when the khutbah starts. The waqt al-karaha begins when the khatib heads towards the minbar. Which has multiple scenarios. Either the sunnah is that there be a place for the khatib to be sitting quietly, because they're supposed to focus before the khutbah. That's how the Prophet used to appear into the congregation, right? So come in and then get onto the place he used to give the khutbah from, like the minbar of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If that's not present, then they should be away. They should, once the Imam gets up and they're walking towards the minbar, from then there should be no prayer. It's makruh tahriman. And we know the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ was giving khutbah and a man came. The Prophet ﷺ asked him, have you prayed? He said, no. He said, get up and pray. But that's considered waqi'atul hal. It's considered to be a specific incident, and it's not generalized. Because specific incidents are subject to context and possibilities. That's why they say waqa'i'ul hal la umuma laha. Specific incidents cannot necessarily be generalized. The general instruction of the Prophet ﷺ is not to pray once the Imam has directed himself to the khutbah. That is given precedence over the specific incident. The specific incident, the context makes it clear. The Prophet ﷺ paused during the khutbah for him to pray. He was looking at him, so the Sahaba looked at him. Afterwards, he started talking about assisting those in need. That's also important. The hadith that's in the Sahihain, right, does not give us all the context. Because the Sahih, for all their, the Sahih, for all their merits, right, and we cannot even express the debt we owe Bukhari and Muslim, etc. But for all their merits, they don't substitute for the rest of the Sunnah. Right? And one of the things, because of their much stricter standards with respect to very often the narrations in Bukhari and Muslim don't have details that the other narrations do. And so that reductionist minimalism, I just want to read the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim. Okay, good. You're missing out. You don't know what actually happened. And I'm consistently surprised even students of knowledge don't know. Have you read any of the other narrations of Hadith Jibreel? There's other narrations of Hadith, there's loads. And they give all kinds of details that gives so much more insight about what happened there. But the ulama, when they explain the Hadith Jibreel in the Sahih or in the commentary for it, they assume that you'll be familiar that some of what they're talking about is in context of the fact that there's other narrations. So they say this is the more likely interpretation. Like, why? Because there's these other narrations. That's why they say, Al-Hadith إذا لم تجمع طرقه لا يفهم معناه. A hadith, if you don't gather its various narrations, you can't understand its meaning. It's like, we say, Hamza is hungry. Mean you're hungry like forever? Hope not. There's a context. You don't understand the context, and we had a lot of attitude divergent brethren at university, so we used to say, Ibn Taymiyyah said yes. One of them said, really? I said, yeah, he must have said yes sometime in his life, right? So that's absurd, right? That's a context. So that's why the majority position across, the majority of the Sahaba, Tabi'een, and Salaf, all held that it's, as mentioned by Qadi Iyad in his Sharh Sahih Muslim, held that it's makruh to pray once the Khatib rises. And they understood that the hadith was contextual, it was not a general ruling. The Shafi'is don't accept that, because they give precedent. The Prophet said it, khalas. Because they're much more willing to specify the general with the specific. And then, it is not permitted to combine two prayers in one time, even with excuse. Right? وعن الجمع بين الصلاتين في وقت واحد بعذر. And this is mentioned sort of at the end of the chapter, but it's not just makruh, right? It's muni'a. It's not allowed. It's not permitted to combine two prayers in one prayer time, even with excuse. So, this goes back to what we already explained about each prayer having its due time. So there's two ways you could theoretically combine, which is Jama' Taqdeem, by performing the second prayer early, so Asr at Dhuhr time. The Asr prayer is an obligatory prayer performed in the time of Asr. It's not the time of Asr, you can't pray it at that time. Or you do Jama' Ta'khir, which you pray Dhuhr and Asr. Its definition, the Dhuhr prayer, is a fard prayer done at Dhuhr time. So you took it out of its time. And the texts on each prayer having its duly apportioned time, that's what's qat'i. Which is why Ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who was known as أعلم الصحابة بعد الخلفاء, he said, Wallahi, ما جمع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم صلاتين قط. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم never joined between two prayers. إنما قدم صلاة وأخر صلاة. He only hastened one prayer and delayed the other. That's called al-Jam' al-Suwari, combining in form. Whether it be when not traveling or when traveling. Even with excuse, such as travel, such as sickness. Situations of necessity are excluded. Because in necessity you could drink alcohol and eat pork. Drink alcohol if you've swallowed something and you're choking to death, you could drink it to the extent of the necessity. That's a separate matter altogether. But there's khilaf. We recognize this khilaf. It's there, but this is the madhab. Now, if a Hanafi is taking another school's opinion, if they're unlearned, you just let them be. It's better that they're praying than they're not praying. That's like the unlearned Ammi. Their practice is just out of necessity. Like they're doing it, it's better that they're doing it than tell them this and that and they won't do it. Let me pray before I get on the flight. They're not going to pray on the flight, let's say. For them, the focus has to be to cultivate their faith and for them to learn their basics. And then they'll know what to do. But the Ammi who has some knowledge, then if you want to take another school's position, then make sure you're doing it validly according to that school. You can't tell that to the unlearned Hanafi, because do they know how to pray validly according to their own school? You tell them, learn how to do it according to the Shafi'i school. Right? In some situations, you just have to let people focus on their iman, focus, encourage them to learn, or even to connect. Sometimes the akhaf al-dararain would be not to correct, and you see this with the ulama, right? They'll see an unlearned person who'll ask them a question. They're seeing, can I say something to them or not without harming them? Right? And that's why it's not a light matter. Shaykh Adib referred to it as sometimes you have to treat with poison. You have to be very careful. Because too much, it will kill the person. Not enough, it won't work. That's our madhab. That's why here Ibn Abidin, so in the Durr al-Mukhtar here it mentions وَلَا بَأْسَ بِالتَّقْلِيدِ عِنْدَ الضَّرُورَةِ. There's nothing wrong with following another school when there is necessity. Ibn Abidin explains, by darura, necessity, he means مَا فِيهِ نَوْعُ حَاجَةٍ, that which there's some need of. But he said, but we've mentioned previously, meaning in the Muqaddimah of Hashid ibn Abdin, that the relied upon position of the school is that taqleedul ghayr jaiz, is permitted to follow another school walau min ghayri darura, even if there's not necessity or need, but with two conditions, which is Firstly, that it be valid. Right? That you're doing an action in a manner that's valid according to the other school. Right? So that you're not piecing things together in a manner that's not valid in either school. And you don't systematically seek out dispensation. تتبع الرخص. Right? Then everything you always seek the easy way out, because that is or would result in fisq, in becoming corrupt. And there's some discussion on how and why that is fisq. That's discussed. I think you make a note. It's discussed in the Tahrir of Ibn al-Humam and discussed in the commentaries on Musallam al-Thubut. Both discuss it. And others. So that's the relied upon position in the school. So the problem arises, for example, when we'd have the RAS conference, some people, what they do is that they'd combine, but they're here for 10 days for the conference and the retreat. So now, in the Shafi'i school, the traveler only combines 3 days, plus the day of arrival and departure. So they can combine, but the traveler's time period is more brief. In our madhab, you're a traveler for 2 weeks, but you can't combine. So now, if you combine beyond the Shafi'i days, that's talfiq. How? Because the Hanafis don't allow the combining, the Shafi'is don't consider a traveler for that long. So no one would say that's valid. So that requires attention, right?
Is there any khilaf in our madhab regarding this issue? Or no?
Of what?
Of combining the prayers?
There are some ulama who allowed it, taking from other schools, okay? Even some of the Indian Pakistani scholars, right? And then it also goes back to people's temperament. One of the great Indian ulama, one of the Syrian mashayikh went to visit him. The Syrians were in extraordinary circumstance, right? Like under oppressive rule, etc. And this is a learned scholar, Hanafi, author of books, and this hadith scholar in the Hijaz was really nice to him, honored him. They even read together. He asked him for an ijazah. He said no. He said, I don't give ijazah for people who don't have a sunnah beard. But then someone explained to him, etc. And they said, may Allah bless you. He wrote a long dua for him, but didn't give him an ijazah. That's up to the person. It's up to the person. This Shaykh was very sick, and you had to take certain medication. Sometimes he'd, after, especially by afternoon, he'd be tired. So frequently he wouldn't be, he'd be totally unconscious all Asr time. Different people said, combine Dhuhr and Asr together. So I'd rather miss the prayer than to pray it invalidly. Because if I pray it after its time due to an excuse, I'm praying a valid prayer. If I pray it early, according to my belief, it's not valid. People are different about it. But there is leeway. There is leeway. Personally, I would avoid doing it. If I ever did it, I'd pray it within its time. So I'd frequently travel with Shafi'i ulama. If, Shaykh Yahya would always be keen. If I didn't pray with him, he'd go in the airport looking for someone to pray in congregation with. He says, Shaykh Yahya, I'm going to miss the flight. And Allah is, even as a traveler, he'd always be really careful to try to catch a congregation with wisdom. It's beautiful. But I don't want to leave the gate right now, because Shaykh Yahya is going to go hunting for a musalli. Because he wants to pray, not just Maghrib with congregation, but also Isha. That's just it. I'll pray with you. But I'd pray it again, and just to make sure he heard it, I'd give the adhan and iqama for my Isha prayer. That I'm praying it again. Right? It's valid. And there's different ways, and we respect those. And sometimes in the same madrasa, one of these issues of ikhtilaf, when I was in Karachi, in the class of Sunan Abi Dawud, one of the hadiths of khilaf came up. So the Shaykh teaching that particular hadith book was from up north. It was a bit intense. So they asked him a question. But, well, some of the Hanafi say that in this opinion, the Malikis have a good argument, etc., maybe more suitable to apply in our times. And they just heard that the day before from someone whose name I won't mention in a recording, who just taught it in one of the other books being taught there in hadith. And they didn't mention his name. And he just mentioned that position first time in his life. He said, only a jahil unpad, only an ignorant person who's not studied the Hanafi madhab would say this. Because of what? The students are having afterwards one of the British scholars who was doing Dawrat al-Hadith at the time came and said, guess what happened today? They thought it was really cool. Look, sometimes the ulama differ. And that's rahmah. But you ask him that so-and-so said it, so that's his right. But said, and what do you have to say? If you let him say, I think it's wrong. But that's good. And that's how truth was. There's a healthy tension in Islamic scholarship that ensures that truth and balance is maintained. So that's the thing. So someone finds it difficult. They're traveling with other people, etc. There are of the Hanafis who would combine. They'll say it's better to pray on the ground in a manner valid according to one school than risk the prayer later. Say no, if you're in the air, pray as best you can, and it's better to pray it on time. Different perspectives. Okay. Then the adhan. He tells us, Sunnah, أي الأذان للفرائض بلا ترجيع ولحن. The adhan is an emphasized sunnah, and it's of the sha'air of the religion for men. Right? Because the purpose of the adhan is the congregation, is to call to prayer. But it's a sunnah for men praying on their own if the adhan is not given in their area. Why? Because the complete performance of a man's prayer is with congregation. And from the muqaddimat of the congregation is the adhan. So it's a sunnah for the fard prayers, for men. It's not legislated for women. The Prophet ﷺ did not teach it to women. The women during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when they're praying at home, it is not recorded that they prayed. That they prayed with adhan. Bila tarjiyah. Tarjiyah is because it's given with a loud voice. Tarjiyah is to say it quietly first. You say Hayya ala al-falah, Hayya ala al-falah, Hayya ala al-falah, etc. Walahan, and without mispronunciation. ويزيد بعد فلاح أذان الفجر الصلاة خير من النوم مرتين. And after the salah, hayya ala salah, of the fajr adhan, one adds, prayer is better than sleep. As-salatu khayrun min an-nawm. Twice. This is sunnah to add. Right? And then he tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, that وَالْإِقَامَةُ مِثْلُهُ. The iqama is like the iqama is like the adhan. Okay? The iqama is like the adhan, except that the adhan is given at a steady pace, and the adhan is given at a steady pace, and the iqama at a fast pace. The steady pace that one says it with يَتَرَسَّلُ فِيهِ. Right? So after the falah so the iqama is like the adhan in its general structure. Right? And that's why it's actually been referred to in hadith of the Prophet ﷺ as an adhan. Right? الصلاة بين الأذانين لا يرد. Prayer between the two adhans is not rejected. Right? So the iqamah is an adhan. One is an adhan given for people to congregate. The other is an adhan given for people to signify the beginning of the prayer. So the basis is that they're the same in its structure, except that وَيَزِيدُ بَعْدَ فَلَاحِهَا قَدْ قَامَتِ الصَّلَاةِ. One says after its falah, حَيَّ عَلَى falah. So after حَيَّ عَلَى الصَّلَاة, after its falah, one says قَدْ قَامَتِ الصَّلَاةِ. The prayer is about to commence. Right? Now literally, it is the prayer has commenced. Right? Which is why the relied upon position of Imam Abu Hanifa is that once the muazzin says that, the Imam says Allahu Akbar. But the amal in most lands is not on this because people get confused. ويترسل فيه ويحضر فيها ويستقبل بهما القبلة. يترسل, one says it at a steady pace. Right? فيه أي في الأذان. Right? So he uses dhamirology extensively. فيه أي في الأذان. Adhan is male. Steady pace is that one says each set of expressions in one breath. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Pause. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. ويحضر فيها in iqama, one says two sets together. So we say, for example, أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله, أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله, together. Whereas in the other, say أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله, أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. So one pauses between each statement in the way that it's known. One faces the qibla with both, it's sunnah. Unless there's an excuse. You're at work, you have very limited time. So especially for the personal adhan, there's more leeway for that. Right? Both said facing the qibla. وَلَا يَتَكَلَّمُ فِيهِمَا. And one does not speak in them. Slight, and of course it's makruh to greet the mu'adhin, etc. But, or to talk to them, unless there's a need. Slight speech does not require restarting the adhan. Right? Because it would confuse people, right? So like the muadzin's giving the adhan and there's an emergency. Said, we need to pay for the pizza, otherwise they'll ban us from ever ordering again. So he said, just a sec. So he gives the money and continues the adhan. If you can say it without talking, it's better, but slight words don't affect the adhan, should not be done. وَيَلْتَفِتُ يَمِينًا وَشِمَالًا بِالصَّلَاةِ وَالْفَلَاحِ. One turns left and right with the salah and the falah. Right? With the salah and the falah. Right? One turns right with the salah, as-salat, حي على الصلاة, حي على الصلاة, and left with حي على الفلاح, حي على الفلاح. بوجهه, with one's head, not with one's chest, let alone one's feet. Unless one is on the minaret, وَكَانَ لِحَاجَةِ زِيَادَةِ الْإِعْلَامِ. Unless one is in the minaret, and this will help call people from all the directions. Okay. And in the minaret, one can go around. Fingers are placed in the ears for the adhan, right? And one gives reminders for the prayers, tathweeb. And one sits between the two, namely between the adhan and the iqamah, except for maghrib. Right? So he says, وَيَسْتَدِيرُ فِي صَوْمَعَتِهِ. One goes around in the sawma'ah, which is one of the words for the minaret. the minara. And Somara is interesting because it's originally has a different usage. وَيَجْعَلْ أُصْبُعَيْهِ فِي أُذُنَيْهِ, and one places one's fingers in one's ears, and the wisdom in it is that it helps raise one's voice. But the Prophet ﷺ told Sayyidina Bilal to do it. So the stronger position in the madhab is that it's unconditionally recommended. There's another opinion that it is if it helps one raise one's voice. لِلْحَاجَةِ إِلَيْهِ. وَيُثَوِّبْ, and one makes tathweeb. One reminds, and the earlier ulama say no, one shouldn't. And they said it's only in the prayers where there's need for tathweeb. But they say it's need for tathweeb in all the prayers. At-tathweeb is al-i'lam ba'd al-i'lam. It's a reminder after the reminder. So before the iqamah is going to go, with enough time that the people who would come. If they call out, as-salah, as-salah, ayyuha al-musallun. Yani, qad hana waqtu salah. There's different ways. The prayer is about to begin, or they announced in the masjid, the prayer will be, the iqamah will be given in the next 90 seconds. So then people know, okay, get to the prayer hall, whatever, that's good. And it's sunnah to sit between the adhan and the iqamah unless one is praying a sunnah. It's disliked to wait standing. Because of the various hadith. فَلَا تَقُومُوا حَتَّى تَرَوْنِي إِذَا حَانَتِ الصَّلَاةِ فَلَا تَقُومُوا حَتَّى تَرَوْنِي. When the prayer time is becoming close, don't stand waiting until you see me. Right? And other texts as well. The Prophet castigated some people who were standing. Right? Because it indicates that let's get on with things. And it's against the adab, respect due to the prayer. It's against the respect due to the imam. Right? And disrespect of both is serious. And then he tells us rulings of the adhan, amongst them, that one, يُؤَذِّنُ لِلْفَائِتَ وَيُقِيمُ. One gives adhan for the fa'ita, for the missed prayer, and likewise the iqamah. Right? This is for men. Women have an advantage. Women, because they don't have to give the adhan for the fard, they don't have to give the adhan or the iqamah for the current fard, they don't have to do it for the makeup either. But for men, it is sunnah mu'akkada to give the adhan and the iqamah. Now, if you're praying on your own and there's an adhan in your neighborhood, then the hadith applies that adhanul hayyi yakfik. The adhan of your neighborhood is sufficient for you. But it would be recommended to give it quietly, even then. Quietly mean not at a high level, even in the masjid. Another congregation comes later, it's better for them to give quietly the adhan, but the iqamah would be sunnah mu'akkada. So if one's making up missed prayers, for women don't have to do adhan or iqamah for it. They can get a lot more make-up prayers done. But for the first missed prayer, one gives adhan and the iqamah. وَخُيِّرَ فِي الْبَاقِي. And for the rest of the make-up prayers, so if in one gathering one is making up multiple missed prayers, for men, it is sunnah mu'akkada to give adhan for the first one and then the iqamah. And for the rest, giving the iqamah remains an emphasized sunnah, and that the choice is, and they have a choice with respect to, let's go to the translation, the rest. The choice is, so adhan is given for missed prayers for men and the iqamah. Both are sunnah mu'akkada. Likewise, for the first missed prayer, adhan and iqamah are an emphasized sunnah for the first missed prayer, and one has a choice for the rest. Iqamah remains sunnah mu'akkada for every single one. Someone's making up 10 prayers. They would give at least one adhan and 10 iqamas. وَخُيِّرَ فِي الْبَاقِ, but it is superior to give adhan and iqamah for all of them. Because لِأَدَاءِ الصَّلَاةِ عَلَى أَكْمَلِ الْوَجْهَيْنِ, to perform even the makeup على أكمل الوجهين, in the more superior of the two modes. And that's the madhab. But one can leave the adhan, and there you can say the adhan quickly. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. One can leave. It's better to do the adhan, leaving the recommendation of doing it slowly, than leaving it completely. And one of the wisdoms of the adhan and of the iqamah is to focus on tawheed before the amal, which is the salah. Right? And the adhan has numerous spiritual meanings, and we should share. Have you shared it before? From Imam Burhanuddin al-Biqa'i, he has a treatise which is so precious that another scholar quoted the whole thing in explanation of the adhan, on the meanings of the adhan. But in summary, it's tawheed, right? Tawheed, right? It's a reminder in the rush of your living circumstances. Why we say Allahu Akbar 4 times? Just because he's giving the adhan? No, he's reminding you of, he's calling to something, and it's a reminder that the call is not to prayer, the call is to Allah. Hayya ala as-salah, hayya ala al-falah. The falah is not by the prayer, right? That's why the Prophet ﷺ didn't say وَجُلَتْ قُرَّةُ عَيْنِي الصَّلَاةِ. The joy of my eyes is the prayer. It says فِي الصَّلَاةِ. The joy of my eyes is in the prayer. Adhan is not given before its time. And if given before the time, it must be repeated within the time. Right? So, but it's come in the hadith about the adhan given in, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, before the time, because there was 2 adhans during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, particularly during Ramadan. The first one would be to encourage them now to make imsak, to desist from eating. It's also a reminder to help people get up for tahajjud. And in many Muslim countries, and this is not sunnah in our madhab to do, particularly outside Ramadan especially, but some madhabs it is there, and there's a wisdom. Right? And now the thing is, like, even some days I'd sleep really late because working with the team in the US when I was teaching in Amman, and then 30 minutes before Fajr they wake you up. It's good, ultimately. Remember that I woke up and then fell asleep because there's so much time till the Fajr prayer. I was thinking as a Hanafi, like, what are you guys doing? Hey, like, be practical. Once I actually went to Fajr prayer, I had a huge prostration mark on my head. But not because I was engaged in a lot of prostration. What happened, like, I'd gone to sleep at 3 in the morning. An hour and a half later, this loud adhan is given for tahajjud. So I got up, intention of doing, I'd already done tahajjud before. To do tahajjud, got up, went to the toilet. Between my toilet and the sink was just this much space. Terrible design. Right? A drunken sailor could design better than most modern Arab homes. So I leaned forward while still at the toilet, and my forehead was against the sink. I woke up when the iqamah was going. The iqamah is given louder than the adhan. It makes no sense. It's legally offensive too, because it encourages people to be late. It woke me up. So I went with this huge mark. Looked like I don't know, I'd been like banging the ground with my head. It's like, mashallah, you did a lot of ibadah to me. And I was like, anyways. If it's given before its time, it must be repeated within the time. Because إعلام بدخول الوقت. It's a i'lam given because of the entering of the time. And then adhan is disliked from one in a state of major ritual impurity, because they're calling to that which they cannot do. And also their iqama, right? Because imagine, you give the iqama, and you have to rush off to make ghusl. The iqama of the one in ritual impurity is disliked. For obvious reasons. But the adhan of the one in ritual impurity is not makruh. It is khilaf al-awla. It's not makruh. Why? Because let's say the muazzin has an upset stomach, or there's limited water. There's many reasons why, if they were to go make wudu and then give the adhan, they would delay the adhan from its time. In some situations with limited water, in winter, it may be difficult to make wudu twice. Someone had an upset stomach, for example, etc. That's why. Now this is of the rare issues that in Nur al-Idah, what's mentioned there is in Nur al-Idah in the Maraqi, that's contrary to the relied upon position in the madhab. Imam al-Shulmulali inclines towards what? Are you familiar with it? What does Imam al-Shulmulali incline towards? For the? What's dislike for the muhdith? The adhan of the muhdith is makruh, and that's his choice, but that's not the transmitted position of the madhab, and the textual basis of that, or the legal basis of that. Now, more caution, yeah, but nobody's saying it's not better for him to be in. Is that the difference between leaving ترك الأولى لا يقتضي إثبات الكراهة. Leaving what's better does not necessarily entail that doing so is legally disliked. The adhan of a slave or a child of zina or a blind person or a desert Arab aren't what? Yeah, sorry. The adhan of a woman is disliked, prohibitively disliked. Because it's khilaf al-mashru', particularly for men. Right? And women have been discouraged from raising their voices, etc. Talking to men, etc., talking to strangers, etc., has been permitted, but it's kept. The adab is to keep it to the extent of the need or the benefit, religious or worldly, without falling into harm, religious or worldly. But the adhan is khilaf al-mashru', especially for the adhan. And that kayfiyya is not a kayfiyya mustahsana for women. Likewise, the adhan of a corrupt person. Why? Because a corrupt person is not trusted in religious matters. One is people should not trust him, but people are imbeciles sometimes, right? That if a corrupt person is telling you something, why would you believe them? Allah subhanahu tells us, فَتَبَيَّنُوا فَتَثَبَّتُوا. Right? Make sure, confirm. But also, the adhan is a sharaf, right? Is nida'u sharaf ila sharaf, right? It's a call of honor to that which is honorable, the prayer and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A corrupt person not granted that honor, right? In that sense. Now, it's a different thing. You want to get your uncle, like if he doesn't give the adhan, he'll want to lead the prayer. أخف الضررين, let him give the adhan, you'll lead the prayer. That's a different thing. But that's not the public call. One sitting, if able to stand. right? If able to stand. Particularly in the old days also, because the لا يتم الإعلام, because the one who has to sit, presumably, can they go up on the minaret, right? Would the voice carry, etc., right? So if the one who's able to stand and they sit, there's karaha. To give the public adhan sitting, if it affects the projection of the call, and the one drunk, for obvious reasons, right? Because it's a state of corruption. The adhan of a slave, a child, of zina, a blind person, or the desert Arab aren't disliked. And here Imam al-Nasafi is making a point that some of the ulama mentioned the karaha of these things, but the karaha of these things is not due to the person being a slave, but due to the fact that slaves tended not to be learned. They didn't know about the ahkam of the deen, ahkam of tahara, ahkam of adhan. Likewise, the child of zina also, because a child of zina is much more likely to be neglected. It's an unfortunate reality, but that is the reality, right? Now, fiqh does not deal with ideals that all children of zina or this should be whatever. Yes, they should. But the reality is that they're neglected. You see, even of the most noble people, the Prophet ﷺ, even though his uncle loved him, he was not taken care of by the family as the other children were taken care of. Right? There are multiple aspects of that. Right? But anyways, the blind person, this is if they would not be sure about the times, or if it's times, or they can't guard themselves from getting najasa on themselves, or they would not be able to face the qibla, or ignorance. But if none of these meanings are found, then it's fine. And the desert Arab, لِغَلَبَةِ الْجَهْلِ, because the desert Arabs, the Arabi, which is desert Arabs, meaning people who live in rural areas, which is the case against those who say Muslims should move to the countryside, etc. The Prophet was Makki and Madani. And Mecca is called al-Qura, the mother of all cities, the foundational city, and Medina is a city, named city. Anyways, so I have friends who try to convince me to move to these rural areas and stuff. You live in a place where it's barely valid to do Jumu'ah, so let's not talk. Shaykh Salik would try to convince me to go to Mauritania. I said, why would I go to a place where you don't hold Salat al-Jumu'ah? I visit Rahmatullahi alayhi. Murabat al-Hajj. I said, inshallah, but you guys don't pray Jumu'ah out there. Anyways, again, that's why he tells us it's not disliked, because the karaha mention is contingent. And that's one of the things, sometimes for ruling, you're not clear about why, then what is the wajh al-karaha? Right? Sometimes it's contingent. Then he tells us leaving both is disliked for the traveler. Right? Optimally, the male traveler should give adhan and iqamah, even if quietly to themselves. But at least they should give the iqamah, at least. Properly give both. It helps. And a traveler may be more in need of it insofar as travel is a state of distraction. It helps you focus. At work, don't skip the adhan. Focus. Right? But not for one praying at home in the city. This is if they're in a neighborhood where the adhan is given, because adhan al-hayyi yakfihi, because the adhan of the neighborhood is sufficient. And they're both recommended for both, but not for women. What does he say in the Arabic? He said, لا لمصل في بيته في مصر وندبا لهما. And both are recommended for both, meaning for the traveler, both remain recommended. And for the one praying at home, in the city, or at work, or even for a second congregation in the masjid. But دون جهر الأولى. لا للنساء, not for women. Why? هكذا المشروع. Of course, a recorded adhan does not fulfill the sunnah of the adhan. a live broadcasted adhan through radio or whatever medium is considered an adhan. So that would fulfill it. But if on whatever gadget, device, wall clock, an adhan goes, that's nice. It's a nice reminder. Does not substitute for the adhan. Some of the ulama discourage using dhikr for things like ringtones, etc. And there's a good basis for that, especially in the Hanafi madhab, insofar as dhikrullahi mu'azzam. The remembrance of Allah is to be venerated, to be exalted. And the basis is that one does not take the remembrance of Allah for worldly reasons. So they say the one selling groceries, they're selling vegetables, a vegetable stall, it's sinful for them to be making dhikr to call people to buy their vegetables. You say, يعني سبحان الرزاق الرحيم اللطيف سبحان الرزاق اللطيف whatever. But basically what is it? So no, whenever you hear Subhan al-Razaq, al-Latif al-Rahim, this is the grocery store, the guy selling fruits and vegetables. They say unless one does it genuinely in dhikr of Allah. So don't question someone's intent. But similarly, in many Arab countries, if you're going up the stairs in a building, right? Because a lot of times the women would be in the stairwell, they would say, Ya Latif, or they say, Ya Sattar, Ya Sattar, Ya Sattar. This asl is makruh tahriman. Why? Because most people intend al-i'lam, not dhikr. Now, so with ringtones there's ikhtilaf about the matter, but it's safer, unless one is genuinely going to pay attention to it, not allow it to ring in the washroom, etc., etc., etc. So, likewise with the adhan, right? It's also bad adab, because what happens if you have the adhan reminder, a lot of people, what they do, it says Allahu Ak, and they just turn it off. Right? So if you're going to have to turn it off, then don't play it in that way, right? 'Cause especially at work, etc. Because what you're doing, you're stopping the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? You create a dislike for the remembrance of Allah. Put on some other kind of alarm for the times of prayer. A lot of prayer apps allow that. Right? If you're routinely either not going to, you're going to stop it, why are you stopping the adhan? Because I'm at work. Then there's other way. Like something that happens once is an excuse, but al-udhr إذا تكرر لا يبقى عذرا غالبا. An excuse, if it's repeated, is generally not an excuse. So it's better adab, right? And closer to ta'zeem, not to do that. And of course, if the adhan if the digital adhan, if you find that because a digital adhan is played in your house, as a result of which you don't give the adhan, then give away the adhan. Okay, give away the adhan, right? Like, if doing so causes you not to give the adhan, because giving the adhan is an important sunnah, right? Is important. Some of the Mashaykh mentioned it's not mansoos in the madhab, that for women, if they're in a place where the adhan is not given, right? There's no harm just for themselves just to repeat the words so that they can answer the adhan and do the adhkar afterwards. La bas. There's nothing wrong. It's dhikr. It's not a sunnah. It's not specifically recommended. But if they want to do it, because there's a hikmah in it. Because the assumption would be that a Muslim woman would be in a place where they hear the adhan. So that doesn't happen. Just say it to yourself, so you can then repeat the words of the adhan, make the dua afterwards. Because the fuqaha assume that you're a Sunni Muslim. Sunni Muslim is not someone who has some sectarian allegiance, but someone who follows the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? There's a number of things that are not mentioned here because they're so clearly established in the sunnah. One is that listening to the adhan, there's two, is from the adab of the deen. Responding to the adhan, there are two opinions in the madhab. One is responding to adhan is wajib, the other that it is a recommended sunnah. The ijabatul mu'adhin, there are two opinions. One, I didn't skip that in the thing. It doesn't have it in the Kanz, does it? Right? So these are of the masail that are not in the Kanz. It's very important. And you can see the details in Nur al-Idah and also in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah for those of you who are students of knowledge. So answering the adhan, there are two narrations in the madhab. One is wajib. But then it's related in two ways. The ijaba, the answer is either bil qadam or bil lisan. The answering of the adhan is either with one's feet or with one's tongue. Al-ijaba bil lisan, bil qadam, is حتى يقيم جماعة مسنونة ولو في غير المسجد. Right? And this is based on the fact that congregational prayer, the default ruling of it for the one able is that it's wajib. Or it's sunnah muakkada fi quwwatil wajib. They're close. So on that position, if the adhan is wajib, if the congregational prayer is wajib for men, then answering with their feet, meaning that when the adhan is given, then one takes the practical means to be able to pray in congregation. And answering with the tongue is a recommended sunnah. But there's another opinion, there's many opinions amongst the early Hanafis about this, that answering with the tongue as well is wajib. Right? Now the legally stronger position is answering with the feet is wajib to pray as you in the sunnah congregation for yourself. For men, which would be in congregation, to perform the prayer ala wajhin masnoon, in a way that is sunnah. For men to pray in congregation, for women, if they hear the adhan, to take the means to establish the prayer within the sunnah way for them. Answering with the tongue, this also ignored frequently. Even people are like they're in a center or something, adhan's be given, people are talking, people are still reading, right? Answering with the tongue, the Prophet, it's a command of the Prophet فَقُولُوا مِثْلَ مَا قَالَ الْمُؤَذِّنِ. Say, it's a command. Right? Now, it's amru, irshad, etc. There's different ways that legally the command is understood to be for recommendation. And that's the relied upon position. But practical religious caution entails there's a command of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Like, don't be negligent of that, right? Istajibu lillahi wa lirrasul. Answer the call of Allah and His Messenger. إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ لِمَا يُحْيِيكُمْ. When they call you to that which gives you life. And the adhan is of the things that give you life. Its meanings are tremendous. So that's answering the adhan. Right? And there's fiqh related to it. You can see some of the details in Nur al-Idah. Answering the adhan is frequently neglected. Number two is ensuring that you catch the congregation, right? Or pray it in the recommended time. They also say of the clear sunnahs is also that you answer the adhan. Number two, you send blessings on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Number three, you make the dua al-wasila. Right? So you answer the adhan, you send blessings on the Prophet ﷺ and make the dua al-wasila. Now there's ikhtilaf. It's important to be aware of the ikhtilaf. From the 7th century, the Hanafi scholars found a problem. A lot of people would not be sending blessings on the Prophet ﷺ there. So they said, well, the muezzin also supposed to say it. So that the muezzin should raise their voice with the salah on the Prophet ﷺ as well, but less than the adhan. What that generally transmitted in the Hanafi school, most of the mutaakhirin said this is recommended. For the muezzin also to raise his voice with the salah on the Prophet. Always has been Hanafis who've said that's not the asl of the madhab, etc. They've not preferred that. And one of the things to do is just, the muezzin just say it with a loud whisper, so you don't say it out loud, but at least so people are reminded. That's the usefulness of a loud whisper. And the Prophet ﷺ used to give loud whispers. That's why we know all his adhkar. And then to make dua, another neglected sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ said, ad-dua, and then to make the dua al-wasila. Allahumma rabba hadhi ad-da'wat at-tamma. Right? And there's nothing, and Mufti Rafi Usmani said, he learned from his teachers, do not neglect the dua al-wasila. And to say it with the attempt. But he said all these precursors are from this. He said, look throughout prophetic teachings. Is there anything the Prophet ﷺ asked us for whatsoever for what he's done for us? Anything? Nothing. He asked for one thing. Right? So it's the limits of ingratitude that you just ask for one thing and you neglect it. But then he said, if you think about the عظمة هذا النبي الرحيم, right? What is he asking the dua for? اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آتي سيدنا محمد الوسيلة والفضيلة. Right? The intercession and the great honor. وبعثه مقاما محمودا, and grant him the most praised station that you have promised him. Does the Prophet ﷺ need that station? Does Allah need to be convinced to grant it to him? It says it in the dua. الَّذِي وَعْتَ, he's already been promised. So who benefits from that dua al-wasila? Right? Because anytime you make dua, the angels say, we know it textually, may you have the like of what you asked for. And that's from the benefits of salah on the Prophet ﷺ. We say it sincerely. Why do we send the blessings on the Prophet ﷺ? Sincerely for the sake of Allah. Right? But the spiritual benefit returns to the person. The angels say, may you have the like of what you have. The Prophet ﷺ makes dua for you, as we know. But the dua al-wasila, like that. Right? So one should not neglect the dua al-wasila. And then after the dua al-wasila, to make dua for oneself and for the Muslims. And the Prophet ﷺ said, الدعاء بين الأذانين لا يرد. Dua between the two adhans is not rejected. This is from the places of ijabat al-dua. So treat the adhan in that way seriously. Of course, another of the things that in answering the adhan, there are two ways to answer the adhan. The hadiths have come unconditionally. Say what the muadhin says. The others say, in hayya ala salah and hayya ala falah, to say la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam says there's no harm in joining between both. And he argues the usul of the madhab would entail it, etc. Why? Because who are you called? When it says hayya ala salah, you are addressing yourself. That, oh lazy one, oh loser, or lazy one, let's be nice to ourselves. Oh lazy one, hayya ala salah. So you address yourself. Hayya ala al-falah, rush to your eternal good. And then you admit that you don't have the capacity to do it. And he has a beautiful expression. So to stir all the lazy, inert elements within you towards this khair al-azim. And this is how we can act on both the hadiths. And then and Ibn Abdin quotes it, and he mentions that this is quoted by Ibn Amir Hajj and Ibrahim al-Halabi and the author of al-Bahr al-Ra'iq and the great mutaakhirin, and they all concurred with Ibn al-Humam on this. And then Ibn Abdin adds, وَهُ مَذْهَبُ سُلْطَانِ الْعَارِفِينَ سيدي الشيخ محي الدين نفعنا الله تعالى ببركاته. It's also the madhab of the Sultan al-Arifin, Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, and others. So that's about the adhan. Of course, for those of you who've done the beginning of guidance class, Imam Ghazali mentions some beautiful adab related to the adhan and the iqamah. A lot of those apply in our madhab too. Those are from the adab of the deen. Many of these adab, you can find them in, for example, the Muqaddimah al-Ghaznawiyya and its commentary. He goes into many other adab as well. Abu al-Layth al-Samarqandi mentions in his Tanbih al-Ghafilin some of the inward dimensions of the adhan and iqamah as well. So those are some sources. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
What if in the tulu' or ghurub of the sun, a janazah becomes present, or if someone recites an ayah of prostration at that time, could they perform the salatul janazah or the sajdat tilawa in that time? Would it be valid?
So there's two separate things. Is if a ayat of tilawa or a verse of prostration or janazah was due before and now the sun has risen, then that wajaba fi kamil fala yu'adda fi naqis. Now if they come during that time, now there are conflicting considerations. One is not delaying these matters, and the other is the dislike of the time. And how does the dislike of the time affect these? Because the janazah, when does the janazah prayer done? Is there a specific time for it?
It's not delayed.
No, but is there a specific time for it? No. And there's the consideration not delaying it. But this is a waqt of karaha. There are conflicting considerations. So that's why diagram it. It's helpful. It's laid out fully in Nur al-Idah, for example. And there's some, the reason that if you diagram it, you'll notice that there are some challenges. There are some challenges. Reason being because of the confluence of considerations. Right? That's the nature of fiqh. And when there's a confluence of considerations, it's not uncommon that there be difference of opinion. Right? That's where, but it's important to know that there's a confluence of consideration, and this is what's relied upon. But we don't approach that relied upon position like we do the relied upon position where it's qat'i. Right? Because we distinguish between something that's clear cut, such as for Hanafis, not combining two prayers within one time. For Hanafis, it's clear as day. And then we recognize that there's khilaf. But here within our madhab, there's a whole bunch of considerations. So we say, okay, this is a relied upon position. Okay, let's proceed with that. But we're aware that there are other areas. And that's why ijtihad is mercy. Next, we're going to be now looking at what comes up next. Yeah, the conditions and integrals of prayer. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
A lot of books mention that the time of tulu ends if the sun reaches a spear or 2 spears length. Has any tarjih been done over which is more correct?
See, what does it say in the Hadith al-Alayya? Of course, the Hanafis do these interesting things, right? And part of it is just that I would challenge you to find a definition of qadr al-rumh. And it's around, right? But some of the like Shafi'is get so frustrated by the Hanafi. Say, look, if you don't understand it, then just stick to your own stuff, right? Alhamdulillah. Okay.
What is the ruling of Iqamat as-Salah such that if someone forgot it, would they have to repeat the Iqamah?
Good question, I'm not sure. Low Nasiya? I'm not sure. I'm sure it's around Whoever digs finds. So I don't know the answer. So we'll start the other class. What time does Asr come in? Hmm? So we'll pray Asr.